The knife of betrayal doesn't make a sound when it enters your back. I learned that on a Tuesday morning when I discovered that everything I believed about love, trust, and loyalty was a lie. My name is Sarah, and this is my true betrayal story about how I found the one thing that saved me from drowning in a sea of broken promises and shattered dreams. 5 years ago, I thought I was living a fairy tale. Michael and I had been together since college, 8 beautiful years of building dreams, planning our future, and creating what I believed was an unbreakable bond. He was my best friend, my confidant, the person I trusted with every secret, every fear, every hope I had ever carried in my heart. Our apartment overlooked the city skyline, filled with photos of our adventures together. Weekend getaways, family holidays, quiet Sunday mornings where we'd read the newspaper in comfortable silence. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who truly understood me, someone who would never hurt me the way I'd seen others get hurt. Trust came so naturally to us. Or so I thought. I never questioned the late nights at work, the business trips that seemed to multiply, or the way he'd started guarding his phone like a precious treasure. Love, I believed, meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Love meant trust without conditions. How naive I was. The cracks started small, like hairline fractures in a perfect vase. A colleague's name mentioned too often. Jessica from marketing. She's helping me with the new campaign, he'd say with a smile that seemed just a little too bright. I pushed down the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then came the subtle changes. The way he'd angle his phone away when texting. How he'd shower immediately after coming home from work, claiming he needed to wash off the stress of the day. The spontaneous weekend work meetings that couldn't wait until Monday. Each explanation made perfect sense on its own, but together they formed a pattern I was too afraid to acknowledge. I started noticing how he developed new interests, restaurants I'd never heard him mention, music that wasn't his usual style, inside jokes he'd reference but never quite explain. It was like watching someone I knew completely slowly become a stranger, one small change at a time. The most painful part wasn't the lying itself, it was how good he'd become at it. The ease with which false words rolled off his tongue. The conviction in his voice when he'd reassure me that nothing had changed between us. "You're everything to me, Sarah," he'd whisper on the nights when my intuition screamed the loudest. "You always will be." But betrayal has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it's hidden. The moment that shattered my world came disguised as an ordinary evening. Michael was in the shower when his phone, sitting on our kitchen counter, lit up with a message. I wasn't planning to look, trust was still my default setting, even when everything inside me was screaming warnings. But sometimes the universe forces you to see what you need to see. The preview showed enough. "Can't wait to be in your arms again tomorrow. I love you more than she ever could. Jess." Time stopped. The words blurred and refocused as my brain tried to reject what my eyes were seeing. I felt like I was falling through space, watching my entire reality crumble in real time. 8 years of memories, plans, dreams, all of it suddenly felt like a cruel joke. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through their conversation. Months of messages. Photos. Plans for weekend getaways I thought were work trips. Intimate conversations about their future together, a future that didn't include me. The woman I had been worried about for months wasn't just a colleague. She was his girlfriend. His other life. His real choice. The most devastating part was reading how they talked about me. She suspects something, he'd written. I'll handle it. She's not going anywhere. Like I was an obstacle to manage rather than a person to respect. Like our 8 years together was just inconvenience standing in the way of their happiness. When Michael walked into the kitchen 20 minutes later, towel around his waist and that familiar smile on his face, I was sitting there holding his phone. Our eyes met, and in that instant, he knew. The mask he'd been wearing for months finally slipped away. How long? Those were the only words I could manage. Sarah, I can explain. How long? The volume of my own voice surprised me. 6 months, he whispered, and with those 2 words, he confirmed that every I love you he'd spoken to me since then had been a lie. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its honesty. No more careful explanations or gentle deflections. Just raw, ugly truth spilling out like blood from a wound. He was in love with her. Had been for months. Was planning to leave me but didn't know how. As if there was a gentle way to detonate someone's entire existence. The next few weeks passed in a haze of practical devastation. Dividing belongings, finding a new place to live, explaining to family and friends why the wedding they were expecting to plan would never happen. Everyone had opinions about what I should feel, how I should heal, what I should do next. But here's what no one tells you about betrayal: it doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your ability to trust your own judgment. If I could be so wrong about the person I knew better than anyone, how could I ever trust myself to make good decisions again? If 8 years of love could be a lie, what was real? I fell into a darkness deeper than grief. This wasn't just losing someone I loved. This was discovering that the person I loved had never actually existed. The man I'd planned to marry was a character he'd been playing, and I'd been too blind to see through the performance. For months, I lived in that space between anger and numbness, scrolling through our old photos and wondering which smiles were real and which were lies. I avoided places we used to go, people we used to see together. I couldn't bear their pity or their well-meaning advice about moving on. The turning point came on what would have been our 9th anniversary. I was sitting in my small new apartment, surrounded by boxes I still hadn't unpacked, crying over a photo of us from last Christmas. We looked so happy. I looked so happy. That's when I realized something that changed everything. The happiness in that photo was real. My love was real. My joy, my trust, my commitment, all of it was real. Just because he was living a lie didn't mean I was. I had been letting his betrayal retroactively poison every good moment we'd shared. But that gave him power over my past, my present, and my future that he didn't deserve. The betrayal was his choice, his character flaw, his failure, not mine. That night, I started a journal. Not to document my pain, but to reclaim my story. I wrote about the good times and owned them as genuinely good. I wrote about the warning signs I'd ignored and forgave myself for choosing love over suspicion. I wrote about the future I wanted to build, not despite the betrayal, but because of what it had taught me about my own strength. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how to trust wisely instead of blindly. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving. It means refusing to let someone else's choices define your worth. I began reaching out to friends I'd neglected, pursuing hobbies I'd abandoned, taking trips I'd always wanted to take. I discovered that the person I was before Michael was still there, just buried under years of defining myself as half of a couple. Slowly, I started dating again. Not because I needed someone to complete me, but because I wanted to share the complete person I'd become. I learned to see red flags as information rather than challenges to overcome. I discovered that real love doesn't require you to ignore your intuition. Today, 3 years later, I can honestly say that Michael's betrayal was the worst thing and the best thing that ever happened to me. The worst because it shattered my innocence and forced me to confront the reality that people can lie with love in their eyes. The best because it taught me that I am stronger than I ever knew, more resilient than I ever imagined, and worthy of a love that doesn't require me to doubt myself. The best way I found to heal after lies and betrayal wasn't forgiveness, though that came later. It wasn't forgetting, the memories are still there. It was reclaiming my power to write my own story instead of letting someone else's choices be the final chapter. If you're watching this because you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, I want you to know, their betrayal says nothing about your worth and everything about their character. Your love was real, your trust was a gift, and your pain is valid. But you are not broken. You are not naive. You are not responsible for someone else's choices. You are strong enough to rebuild. Wise enough to learn. Brave enough to love again, starting with yourself. Your story doesn't end with their betrayal. It begins again with your courage to heal. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we realize we're not alone. And if you need to hear this, you deserve better, you are worthy of real love, and your best chapters are still being written. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and choosing to heal anyway.